So you'll be doing that instead of doing the work.
All right, gang. It's 10 a.m. Time to get started. Get some return on our investment of presence and time and energy. We'll be working through some definitions on some basic principles on forest recreation, and in particular its management as a particular discipline within forestry and land management, resource management, and taking a particular set of human uses as the primary or highest and best use of that land. In our history section coming up, we'll wrestle with some of the key personalities and some of the kind of the ideas, the dialogues, the arguments that we as a country got into in terms of what is the highest and best use of this land. And for a whole bunch of millions and millions of acres, the highest and best use is recreation. So we gotta have some farmland. We've gotta have some lands to produce fiber, both in terms of cellulosic fibers like wood products and so forth, timber forest products, and non-timber forest products as well. And for some other areas, that's just not the best way to kind of spend this natural capital or maintain or sustain this natural capital that we have as a country. So, in some of those areas, the best way to kind of elevate use of that is to get people into it and help folks have a good time safely and in a way that is sustainable for those resources. So, a lot of the places that tend to be set aside primarily for forest recreation uses, the kinds of things we've started talking about this semester, a lot of them are really pretty fragile ecosystems. If you think about it, we tend to put state parks and national parks around what kind of geographic or geologic features or hydro features? First Tuesday of the month. But what kind of geographic and hydrologic features do you, when you think of like the stereotype national park, when you hear that phrase, what kind of an image comes into your mind? Big. Okay, a big what?
Vast area. Normally.
Most have some kind of big like mountain range.
A mountain range. Yeah, absolutely. Or a riverways. Or a national grasslands. Or a lot of our national forests, which host a couple of 100 million visits of recreation use per year. A lot of hunting and stuff like that, a lot of fishing on national forests. The spots that we like to go for recreation, like those mountain summits, or those cliff edges where we get a pretty sick sunset view, or along the Blue Ridge Parkway, if anybody's been out east and driven along the Shenandoah Ridge line across 70 or 80 miles of just one amazing view to the left or the right after another. Or the Tetons, the youngest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere and one of the tallest and sharpest and pointiest. But you think about the plants and the animals that have to sustain their existence in those environments. Yellowstone is a high plateau, and the winters at Yellowstone are really harsh. Mentioned briefly at the beginning of the semester that one year we were scheduled to go to Yellowstone, and I got a call from a park ranger on the first day of summer camp saying, "Hey, we just got 6-foot snowdrifts up here. You need to change your trip." Not like we'll kind of wait and see. They had 6-foot snowdrifts, and they weren't even going to start attempting to plow them until the end of June. Like that's where we tend to place our parks. And that has consequences for us as both recreationists using them and as foresters trying to protect these spots and provide them to people via access and opportunity. So, for today, let's take out a sheet of paper and we'll get back to notes later on. But for now, let's do a capacity assessment. This is a pretty open-ended exercise in the sense of I want you to pick out of your personal knowledge, your own repertoire, one protected area that is familiar to you. Like you've been there. Maybe it's a local park that you grew up by, like a neighborhood park, a dog walking park, an opportunistic recreation kind of a park. Maybe it is a bigger spot, like 150 miles plus of Ozark Scenic Riverways and a couple of hundred miles, several hundred miles of shoreline along that. Whatever that place is for you. For me, I would choose Acadia National Park. It's where my wife and I fell in love. Where I got to do a bunch of graduate research. It was pretty cool. Got to work there a bunch of summers. Got to take students there. Went there last summer for summer camp. It's a magical place. But wherever that place is for you, big or small, popular or unknown, up to you. Title this exercise Capacity Assessment. And now for this place, whether or not it's a good match with this place, pick one forest or outdoor recreation activity. So more specific is better. Like if you're into climbing, specify dynamic sport climbing or bouldering or something like that instead of just climbing. More specific is better for something like this. It helps you say no to some things, which is very, very helpful. Okay. If your thing is wrenching on motorcycles and riding around, be more specific, like off-road, cross-country, trail riding on how many cc's, what's the displacement of your dirt bike's engine or motor. Okay. Cool. So, everybody got a place? Show of hands. Awesome. Everybody got an activity picked out. It might just be ratchet basic walking. That's fine. Like, a lot of Americans do a lot of walking. That's a good thing. We are evolved highly to walk. Everybody got an activity? Found half of the class so far. Okay. If you're not sure what one activity might be, you can go with something basic like frolfing, disc golfing, or recreational swimming, like swimming hole swimming, not like lap swimming. That's recreational technically, but does anybody wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to have a lot of fun swimming laps today? Maybe not. Okay. So, for this place, relative to this activity that you've chosen, and understanding that there are a lot of other places and a lot of other activities and a whole lot of combination across both of those lists, for just this one place and this one activity, kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, a so-called Likert type scale, give yourself, or that combination of place and activity, what's the appeal? If you chose a local park that is pancake flat up where you're from in Kankakee or wherever, and your activity is rock climbing, the appeal, I'm guessing, is probably going to be pretty low. But it's on that scale from 0 to 10. From the perspective of the recreationist, how much money would it take for the visitor to be able to enjoy that activity at that place? Like, are we on the hook to buy a dirt bike or afford a dirt bike, or we're just walking? On a scale of $0 up to, let's say, $1 million, where on that spectrum does your activity fall relative to the specific place that you chose to do it? So the answers are not going to be the same for everybody, obviously. If we chose rock climbing as our activity, dynamic sport climbing, So you're like leaping from one hold to another, and you're bolted to the rock. With your PPE or personal protective equipment, your harness, rope, and all that, greaves and stick clips, all the fancy hardware you get over at Shawnee Trails. That could be a couple $1,000, several grand worth of climbing equipment. If you're just walking, how much does a pair of shoes cost? These days, how much a fresh pair of Nikes for that drip while you're walking? Okay.
But I'm not gonna wear my nice shoes.
You mean you have to have specialized equipment? All right, so that's gonna crank up our cost a little bit. Another pair of shoes, or boots, or Tevas or Chacos. If you're a real dirt worshipping hippie, like me. All right. A scale of 0 minutes up to 24 hours. Where on that scale is the time commitment from the perspective of your visitor, of your recreationist, to do this activity at this place? Is it, and this is start to finish, this is soup to nuts. So this is like traveling into the place, doing the thing, set up, tear down, factor in some time for snacks and potty break and driving out. Like, it's not just the activity, it's also the travel to and from and everything else. Okay, cool. So, scale of 0 minutes to 24 hours, $0 to $1 million. Where are you on each of these scales for this place and this activity? What's a brief list of equipment needed for just this activity? So, again, if you chose your activity as fishing, now we want to be a little bit more specific, right? Because getting the $3 fiberglass pole from Walmart is not the same thing as fly fishing up in Montana with a custom Kevlar rod that you hand built and apply the resin to, and like design using aerospace materials and so forth. Not the same thing. Put in a list out equipment. So this isn't really a scale thing. This is more like a one or a couple of sentences, short paragraph. Nothing super fancy. Okay. Any questions so far on our little exercise? The beautiful part of this is that there's not really any wrong answers. So with the capacity assessment, this is a planning tool for all kinds of different forest management needs, not just forest and outdoor recreation. And there are lots of different ways to format it. And the most important thing here is that you just gotta unclench, for a moment and realize, my answers aren't gonna be exactly right. The next person sitting in the desk next to me is gonna have a slightly different list of equipment, even if we chose the same place and the same activity. For sport climbing, for example, some folks like to have stick clips and have like 50 jangling things hanging off their harness and stuff like that so they can just go ham. There's some people get a satisfaction from having all of the stuff, and other people are like, no, I want to test the limits of what my finger pads can do, and yeah, I'll use my safety equipment and so forth to not die so I can try again tomorrow if it doesn't go so well. But yeah, I don't want to deal with controlled rate descenders and stick clips and stuff like that. I want to meld with the wall, be one with the crux of the pitch so I can full send it, as they say. Okay. Cool. Now, next one. What named skills are necessary from the perspective of the recreationist again, to do this activity in this place safely and effectively, not necessarily sustainably? We can't assume that our visitors have any interest. Most of them do. Oh God, it wouldn't work otherwise. But we can't assume that most of our visitors are thinking real hard about sustaining this facility, the built environment, of the trail, of the climbing area, of the rock crawling in jeeps or whatever, whatever the activity is, it's going to need some kind of an at least partially built environment. We're going to need roads to get to these sites, for example. Okay. But before we get to the infrastructure, like roads, what are any of the named skills involved? For rock climbing, you might need to know a double figure eight on a bike. It's a fancy way for saying a safety of life climbing knot that you will connect your lifeline, your load bearing dynamic line hopefully, to your velvet harness. And a stop knot for it. What skills are your recreationists going to need? We'll go ahead and collapse the next bullet point into that as well. What knowledge are your recreationists going to need? They need to know that certain equipment exists. They need to know certain things alongside being skilled in certain things in order to access the place. Knowledge of climate and weather patterns. Climbing in the Wall Street area just outside of Moab, Utah, for example, is a very, very, very different proposition at 3 in the afternoon in August versus at 2 in the morning that same day in August. There is a very, very serious temperature gradient. That dark Navajo sandstone absorbs heat and is a huge thermal mass and is brutal in the afternoon sun of the desert on the Colorado Plateau. So what knowledge do you folks need? This is another, just a sentence or two, just an informal list. This is no kind of an essay, no big pressure. So far, so good? Great. Okay, next. How much physical space, like how much surface area on the planet is this recreationist, or each recreationist, going to need to do this? For rock climbing, it's a relatively small amount of space on the map because most of the vertical lineal feature that you're following, the pitch or the route, is sort of invisible when viewed from above. You just need a little patch at the bottom and typically a little patch at the top, and maybe some access trails if you're going to rappel or abseil down into the climb, although that's a little bit less common. If you're going off-road motorcycling, dirt biking, OHV riding, throwing up big old rooster tails of mud and dirt, we can't call it soil once it's being rooster-tailed. Dirt is soil that's out of place. You need a lot of area for that. Like hundreds or thousands of acres for some of these bigger parks and parcels out west. Thousands and thousands of acres. You might need less than one for a specific rock climbing site. And neither one of those is wrong. Neither one of those is better than the other. But they do have meaningfully different needs in terms of having the capacity to accommodate off-road motorcycling versus accommodating a bunch of rock climbers or a few rock climbers. For some of these activities, there is a preference on area needed, as well as actual literal area needed. One example of this might be if your activity is beach going, heading to the beach and splashing around on the surf and having a picnic lunch and laying out and tanning, maybe scrambling around on the cliffs nearby and so forth, just hanging out at the beach. There's a difference between going to a big, public, crowded beach in like Miami-Dade County versus a little secluded, unnamed beach on the Atlantic shore of a park like Acadia National Park where there is literally no road and not even really a trail to get to it. And the only people that go to that little cobble beach, which might be the same physical size as any particular stretch of beach in Miami-Dade County, completely different vibe, as the youth these days would say. Okay. Yeah, we have some technical professional terms for vibe and stuff like that. And we'll get into those, maybe in some later classes even. But for now, what's the physical area literally needed? And what's the sense of the area that a typical recreationist of this activity in this place is kind of looking for? Is it a secluded spot? Is it better when it's busier? There are some activities like that too, and that's fine. Again, neither one is better than the other, they're just different. Okay? All right. New line, infrastructure. This is all of the infrastructure. Is electricity needed nearby? What about potable water, drinkable, treated water? What about open water, like a pond or a lake? Flowing water, like a waterfall or stream or river? What about shelters, like picnic shelters or camping shelters? The Appalachian Trail, which we've talked about earlier in the semester, has about 200 three-sided, they're rectangular, but one wall is left off so you can just walk in and walk out. About 200 of those sprinkled along the trail, on average about every 10 miles, anywhere from 5 to 25 miles apart. And a lot of folks don't even hike the AT with a tent in shorter sections, they just hike from shelter to shelter. That's infrastructure. Somebody had to build those, somebody's got to maintain them every once in a while, somebody's got to chase the bears from trying to overwinter in or underneath them periodically as well. That's where the rangers come in. We're going.
Would a parking lot count?
A parking lot absolutely counts. So does the road system attached to it. And things like traffic lights. We don't really think of traffic engineering in parks. But any of you guys up from Chicagoland, like down here to get as far away from your family as you can while staying in-state for tuition? I dig it. All right. Have you guys ever been to like Warren Dunes or Sleeping Bear Dunes? Okay, what's your sense of those places in terms of like traffic infrastructure, parking lots? Sleeping Bear Dunes is, I believe, just a state park, right? Just a state park. Like, there's nothing wrong with being a state park. It's fine.
It's crazy.
It gets
really crazy.
When you say
Sometimes
crazy, what do you mean?
Just really populated, hard to find parking, hard to find like a nice place to sit on a beach sometimes. Yeah, it depends a lot when you go, but it's very different than if there weren't people.
Now think about that for a sec. That's on Lake Michigan?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's weird. Like, Sleeping Bear Dunes sees between 2 and 3 million visitors a year on a typical year, and all parks are still in this explosion of extra use following the pandemic. People realize, wow, sitting in my house all day long and staring at the same walls is horrible. Let me go out and do stuff. And we're seeing that very directly in parks. So, I mean, that's a couple of million visitors. How big is Sleeping Bear Dunes? Not in terms of specific quantitative number, but just like big, small, sprawling, postage stamp.
It's like pretty mid-size, but probably towards the smaller size. I know like the dunes, Warren Dunes and Vienna Dunes, those are like pretty small. Not a lot of like area open to like the public either. A few trails, short section of beach.
We got a state line, we got Chicago, we got some small sand duney parks. Let's think about this for just a sec, just in a little bit more detail. And the same considerations apply to the place that you've chosen for this written exercise today. That is, do we have a lot of space and a lot of people? We have a lot of people and not a lot of space, and sort of all four possible combinations. Not a lot of space, but not a lot of people, probably okay. A lot of space, not a lot of people, probably okay, unless a very wild and unconfined type of recreation is the one that you've chosen, in which case each individual person needs a ton of space. At Denali National Park up in Alaska, the interior wilderness compartment is about 6 million acres. And each of the wilderness interior there, and there's like a whole bunch of extra collar wilderness around it. But if you go backpacking at Denali National Park and so forth, you put together an itinerary, basically a list of sections of that wilderness, each 10 to 25,000 acres, speaking in round numbers. And when you're in that compartment, you're the only group, solo up to a group of 5 or 6 people, you're the only group in that compartment. You are consuming, for the time that you're there, 10 to 25,000 acres per group. So some activities in some places, wilderness backpacking at Denali being one of them, just requires an absolutely stupefying thousands of acres per person in order to provide the sense of wildland recreation, unconfined recreation, primitive recreation. There are no trails available in any of those compartments by an act of Congress. Okay? So, none of this is better or worse, just very different. Warren Dunes, Sleeping Bear Dunes. We're going to have not just trails, but parking lots. And we could have pit toilets, but if we're dealing with a couple of million people, if you've ever been to like a poorly run music concert like Fire Festival or something, pit toilets may not be enough for millions of people over the course of about 4 months of so-called peak season, right? Where very few people are going to enjoy beach going at Sleeping Bear Dunes or Warren Dunes in January. You know, there's nothing wrong with Sleeping Bear Dunes. It's not any worse in January. It's just less comfortable and easy in the winter versus in the summer. So, part of the knowledge piece is what part of the year is everybody going to be trying to do this? What's the peak season, as it's called? Versus, does it have a real wide, fat, so-called shoulder season on each side? Maybe spring and fall, if this is a summer peak season place, where in the spring, it's warm, but it's not too hot. And in the fall, it's cool, but it's not too cold. And then in the winter, nobody's there. And seasonals work somewhere else. Superintendent, permanent staff get to catch their breath, work on projects, build stuff, that sort of thing all winter long. And get ready for the next summer's busy season. Okay? So, with all that said, does your park or protected area in your mind's eye, does it require cell phone coverage as one part of its infrastructure? When I was graduating college in 2003, back they were still like chiseling out the first wheel prototypes and stuff like that. One of the big public debates, and they were pissed off, angry people on both sides of this, well, on multiple sides of this debate, not just two sides, of should there be the very first cell towers placed in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Some folks on the yay side are like, man, think of how much easier and faster and safer and more effective search and rescue is going to be with people getting lost in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And folks kind of against it were like, look, this is a one-way downward slide. The moment we break the seal, as they say in party culture, on putting cell towers inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park, then people are going to come to expect it, come to rely on it, and we'll have to put more towers in deeper in. Because if you don't have line of sight to a cell tower, and it's not within about a 1 mile range, your cell phone's not going to see it. It is as if the tower doesn't exist. So, in order to provide that sense of safety, that that safety net of search and rescue. I can dial out and get to emergency services if I need them in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. That changes fundamentally the appeal of going to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There are a lot of people who go into the Shawnee, specifically into the places where there's no cell phone coverage, so their phone can't go off. Like, nobody's holding a gun to our heads to get this stuff to answer our phones, but a lot of companies have figured out how to monetize us, to activate us by giving us little pings and notifications and, access to loot boxes with cooldown timers and stuff like that. Really get you addicted. It works really well, like really well. Another story for another time. All right. Any questions about our capacity assessment exercise so far? Everybody's got a spot. Everybody's got an activity. And relative to those two things in combination, some sense of these 8 things, which we're really collapsing down into 7. Again, we're collapsing skills and knowledge down together. They are separate things. Knowledge is information that you know. Skills are things that you can do. But for our purposes today, introductory class, good enough to roll them together. So 7 sections on the page. All right, let's hear what you got. Any volunteers for first, the place you chose and the activity involved? And as I said before, there are not any wrong answers for this. This is not a quiz kind of an activity. This is just an exercise. So, any volunteers?
I chose Touch Nature,
Touch of Nature Environmental Center,
and I chose
a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And Climate?
Canoeing.
Canoeing. My bad. All right. So, appeal 1 to 10. Is it pretty okay, or?
I think I thought because it was pretty calm lake, and pretty low populated even with some.
Right on. Anybody else ever been canoeing over at Touch of Nature? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, good. Whew. Scared for a sec there. All right. Good deal. How much does it cost?
I said for the expected kind of equipment would be, I'd say, a water bottle and closed-toed shoes for just the average person. So I said anywhere from $25 to $200 if you're doing it through a summer camp.
Okay. Right on. 25 to 200. Both of those are numbers that people make in 1 hour, depending on your career track. So that sounds pretty accessible. Now, it takes a while to work up to $200 an hour in pay, but that's a possibility. That's a thing. I consulted on a court case, and the pay was about that. As an expert witness for a forest preserve by Chicago, yeah, people were getting hurt on some of their trails. It was bad. Anyway, and man, those lawyers are scary people. Do not ever get wrapped up in court cases. Just don't. Friends don't let friends. Anyway. All right, so money is something we can afford this trip with anywhere from 1 to 20 or so hours of work. Okay, cool. How about time? What's the time commitment on something like this? Is this a 6-month trip? Like a 3-hour tour like Gilligan's Island, or something in between?
I said anywhere from 2 to 10 hours. The lowest programming I've learned is an hour to the 100-hour trip.
Okay. All right, so you said 10 hours for launching and coming back and doing that whole rock the canoe and flip it and drain all that water that we took on out? Okay. Good deal. Equipment, obviously the canoe and paddles. What else?
I've seen more of an individual, what they should show up for.
Okay.
Is
That works too.
That one, but I just said really, because we've taken little kids out, so all they showed up was a water bottle, closed-toed shoes.
Okay. And presumably swimwear. And potentially sunblock if they're as pasty white as I am. Okay, no judgment. I was born this way, Lady Gaga sings, right? It's okay if I gotta use something. All right. Equipment, skills, and knowledge on the part of the recreationist.
We led like pretty beginner level with even like kids down to 6. So I said, kind of the knowledge of the difference between your left and right for paddling. And then that's about it.
Okay, right on. Cool. How about the area per canoe? This is a weird thing to think about, but is this like a 10,000 to 25,000 acres of water per canoe kind of Denali situation, or is this more like a 1 to 2 meters of surface area per person, like on a city sidewalk, is the math that civil engineers are doing on sidewalks. 1 to 2 meters per person. What kind of space or area, maneuverability are we going to need typically per canoe?
I was thinking, I guess if you did per canoe, maybe 2 acres per canoe, because I was thinking about the code. We took 8 canoes out and code, it's probably about 10 acres.
Yeah, okay. Does that make sense? All right. So again, if we think about recreationists as another wildlife species, humans as another wildlife species, this is a way to ask a habitat question. How much space per individual wildlife organism, human recreationist mounted in a canoe, is needed? This is a real thing. Like, this was where the math gets real serious, because parks are generally static in size. So we can't manipulate the area that we have available, the supply. And demand is always changing with things like the COVID-19 pandemic and so forth, right? So, area, this is where some of these other things start looking pretty useful to not manipulate, not control, hopefully, but influence, work with, in order to, if we need to, if we have a year where we just have a bunch more canoes and the same size lake to deal with, we can figure out some way to stagger people launching so they're not all crowding the same facility at the same moment. Or maybe clustering groups. So we have 5 different families out on the water, and we say to each of those families, hey, if you could, you've got 3, 4, 5 canoes in your group, that's awesome, have a great time. If you could generally try to give others some space around this lake, let each one kind of tuck into their own cove so they're not hearing and seeing everybody else the whole time. And they can have a sense of this place to themselves, even though we're all kind of sharing it. All right? So allocation becomes a non-trivial thing, and this is pretty interesting stuff when you get right into it. All right, what infrastructure is needed? Do we need like flat screen TVs, satellite television, Keurig coffee makers for this to be a successful recreation activity, or more like we need what? Built environment.
So like roads to and from the lake, parking lot. I said maybe like a shed for storage for canoes and equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess you don't need it, but
Okay. There's a road down to the water, at least at one of the launches at Touch. Camp 2, that's one thing. Okay, yeah. That's important too. Every once in a while, hopefully very once in a while, somebody's gonna need a trip to the hospital. And that's okay. So we want to be planning for what's the ideal in terms of the experience that somebody's going to be looking for, and also what is the worst case scenario, so that if we're planning for and we are ready for and built out for, equipped for the worst case scenario. For example, Touch Nature has several areas that are specifically maintained as multi-use, like open, wide, flat spots with a clear canopy cut back quite a distance, so that if we really, really, really had to, we could airlift somebody out of there. And not even need roads for the ambulance to get back there, because that would be a long trip for the ambulance, and it's still a long trip for a helicopter, and a very dangerous one. The sheer winds on dropping down below tree line on a ridge like at Touch of Nature, they can absolutely overwhelm even a skilled helicopter pilot. Later on this semester, if you guys want to, we'll take a look at some videos of high mountain helicopter rescues, which are extremely dangerous. But you still do it, right? There's this sense of if somebody needs help, we're going to go render aid to that person. There is an affirmative rescue extraction policy in places like the entire United States National Park System. In fact, the most expensive search and rescue effort was $250,000 helicopter extraction. The air is so thin on top of Denali at 21,000 feet, and they had to extract a group that was getting into some hypothermia situations, which happens pretty easily up there, and some bad weather was coming in, as it does. The helicopter could pick up one person at a time because the air was so thin, the helicopter blades couldn't produce enough downforce to lift off with more than one distressed mountaineer at a time. So not only is it dangerous because, you know, the winds are not just blowing, they're like coming up one side of this ridge that you're trying to land this helicopter on, you're going down the other side of it and trying to torque the helicopter and just toss it down like a beach ball. You got to do that over and over and over. So that's very, very, very high risk exposure. And some very brave people have lost their lives in order to help their fellow human being out of some sticky situations. So, okay, we have the sense of, man, there's a lot that goes into being a park ranger, and a lot of different more specialized roles within that sort of umbrella term of park ranger. Anybody else? What was the place you chose and the activity you envisioned doing in it?
Backcountry camping in the Badlands National Park.
Backcountry camping in Badlands. Sign me up.
Yeah. When I said I don't know, I feel like Appeal is like very, very appealing place. I don't know I said like an 8 for that. I feel like most people don't. They look for more of a wooded area to go backpacking.
Yeah. What was it? Not the Roosevelt. There's a national forest right there at Badlands. We can talk about the national forest. Blackberries. Anyway, whatever. It'll come to me that like as soon as class is over and everybody's gone. Go on.
Money I said like a grand. That again for the equipment for backpacking. It's super expensive, but basically just equipment and travel. Time I said 24 hours because you're spending the night, but that could be stretched out to 2 days if you wanted to do it. Equipment, we got like shoes, backpack, food, tent, sleeping pad, sleeping bag, water, stove, shower, toilet paper. Yeah. That could be expanded on for sure depending on, that's like the bare minimum for
Alright.
skills, I said like you need a little bit of hiking endurance, you need to be able to set up a tent, you need to know how much water you're going to need, probably going to be able to want to read a map. Area, I said like, I know general rule of thumb there, when I went to like, you want to be staying a mile from any trail. So I kind of just said, 4 miles. But, yeah, that's another way there. And then infrastructure, really not that much. Obviously, you're going to need a place to park. And then you're going to need a road to get to the parking lot. Probably going to want like somewhere to fill up water. And then somewhere you can get a map or more information from.
Badlands is a high information requirement place to survive. It's very cold, very hot, and very dry, and very tranquil. even after I had to deal with feral horses stampeding through my campsites one time. Never again. We are not doing that again. No, we aren't. Okay. Cool. So, area and infrastructure. You got area. Infrastructure, high or low infrastructure, kind of an environment.
Pretty low there. I mean, it's low for like this activity. Obviously, any national park has a fair amount of infrastructure like buildings. They need that for so many people, but I don't think you need much for this activity. But you can bring in your own maps and your own water, just park and go out there. And not have to go into any building if you don't want.
So consider the following hypothetical Nebraska-shaped national park, let's say, like Badlands, where you have these big interior compartments of sort of little W wilderness, not formally designated, but wildland. Very low infrastructure. You might have some trails through there, but hopefully not too many. If you need to park, or if you need to camp at least a mile from trails, for every trail that's in there, you gotta have an imaginary or map analysis buffer of what that space excludes people from doing. This is called a corridor in management purposes. Okay? So, with a lot of national parks, a lot of state parks and so forth, we tend to have like a visitor center, maybe over a very large one, 2 or 3 visitor centers. They tend to be around an edge. Like Grand Canyon, all of this stuff is just sort of inside the border, but at the edge, so that the entire interior space is whatever the canyon, or wilderness area, or backpacking area, or whatever it is, has the space to be that thing. And also, it's really hard to build roads down into the Grand Canyon, so we're going to build them where they're flat and basically sustainable-ish, for the most part, on the edges. Okay? So, all the area in your selected park or the protected area, it's not created equal. Or at least it's not equal in terms of management purpose and providing amenities. From our first class session is services rendered to you through infrastructure. So, those backpackers are going to need some water. There's not a lot of water sources in Badlands for backpacking. And for backpacking purposes, you're going to need 1 to 2 gallons per person per day. That's a lot, especially in a more desert or semi-arid environment like Badlands, even though it's high latitude. The colder, the higher latitude and higher elevation that a place like Badlands is, the drier the air most typically. And so people need even more water just to survive each day versus a spot like Crab Orchard, where the air is well humidified and your body doesn't have to bring the air in lungs up to 100% relative humidity or fully saturated so that you can do oxygen exchange and carbon dioxide exchange. It's already most of the way there. So, that's a lot to have to tally up. This is a non-trivial process. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Go ahead and if you are satisfied with your sort of assessment on this one so far, go ahead and put your name on it and pass it forward. I'll give you credit for your work today. If you'd like some extra time to work on this on your own after class, you may bring it into Thursday's class session as well. No problem. All right? Either way works. So from here, we're going to start talking in a little bit more detail about resource-dependent kinds of recreation. Big water kayaking, big drop kayaking is profoundly dependent on having a very specific resource and a very specific topography during a very specific season and temperature range and a very specific crowding level and so forth. Like, that's a lot of needles to thread. That's a lot of very tiny specific boxes to check for somebody to be able to access this. Very specific skill requirements and equipment and infrastructure to get to these places and so on and so forth. Okay? So, we're gonna go from the general sort of hypothetical case that we talked through today get into a little bit more specific detail all around the world and see how we do forestry in this kind of demanding environment. Sound good? That's where we're headed from here. Pass stuff up. Otherwise, we are good to go. See you on Thursday. Thank you.